Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University. A few weeks ago, Birdkeeper Toby made this video sort of reworking the lore of Mewtwo a little bit into a way that he thought would be more interesting, would be better, more immersive into the Pokemon universe. And while I was watching the video, I thought, man, there really is a lot missing from Mewtwo's lore. But what Toby didn't really get into was the sort of biological side of some of these things that he talked about. So that's what I'm here to do as your resident Pokemon scientist. So in case you've been living under a rock and roller for the last 20 plus years, I'll give you just a very brief recap of Mewtwo's sort of canon lore, or at least the lore that's well known among most Pokemon fans. So basically, Team Rocket wanted to create the most powerful Pokemon ever to help them in their nefarious deeds, all their evil plots. And so they took the fossil of the most powerful known Pokemon at the time, Mew, and beefed it up, cloned it, and made the most powerful Pokemon known to man at the time. And that's basically it. That's just kind of its story. But cloning doesn't do that. For example, let's take a look at the first ever successfully cloned mammal, whose name is Dolly the sheep. So Dolly, in every way, was an exact genetic replica of the sheep that she was cloned from. Dolly wasn't stronger in a really measurable way. She wasn't more powerful than the original sheep that her DNA came from. So cloning, by its definition, is creating an exact genetic replica of the original specimen. So how did Mew turn into Mewtwo? For a while, when the games first came out, this was just chalked up to it's sort of science fiction-y. You can't do that in the real world, so we just kind of brushed it off and said that's just some technology that they have in the Pokemon world that we don't. However, as of the early to mid 2000s, that's no longer true. Around that time, a revolutionary new tool in biology and genetic engineering was sort of discovered and really researched heavily. And you might have heard of it by its more common name, but I'm a scientist, so I'm going to hit you with the longer name first. And it's kind of long and complex, and I don't even know it, so I'm going to have to read it off my computer screen for you. So the technical name is Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, more commonly known as CRISPR. A little bit of the biological background of CRISPR. Basically, it's segments of DNA in prokaryotic organisms, which are bacteria and archaea, single-celled things that you can really only see under a microscope, that code for what essentially works as a cut-and-paste protein in their DNA. Using CRISPR, you could, theoretically, actually it's not even theoretical anymore, you can actually do this. You can cut a certain spot of mouse DNA, and you could basically paste a piece of fish DNA that you previously cut into that spot that you just cut. So now you have a genetically altered mouse that has fish DNA in it. That's something that's very real and that people are doing somewhat regularly in biological laboratories all over the world now. And to give you just a sort of a fun example of the real world that will later sort of apply to this being used on Mew, is some work out of China from the early to mid 2010s. So essentially there's this gene in dogs called the Myostatin gene that sort of regulates their muscle production. And this laboratory out of China more or less found a way to change that so that it just doesn't regulate their muscles and that they just keep building and building muscles. I've talked about it a little bit on this channel before, but not so much in this kind of in-depthness as I'm going to now. For all intents and purposes, they basically just made bodybuilder dogs. And that's kind of analogous to, at least initially, what I thought that they did to change Mew into Mewtwo, where instead of doing it with physical muscles, they did it with its mental psychic muscles to amp up its psychic powers. However, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that that's probably not the only thing that they did to turn Mew into Mewtwo. because while these CRISPR dogs are incredibly muscular, they're still dogs, They still have all the characteristics of a dog. Whereas if you look at Mew and Mewtwo, they're very, very different looking organisms. Just as, body proportions, Mewtwo is seemingly quite muscular looking and stands very firmly on two legs, whereas Mew seems like it's pretty weak looking. I think it'd be very, very hard to turn Mew into Mewtwo just by altering like a single gene to make it more psychically powerful. So what else could they have done? Well, if you're like most other Pokemon fans, including myself, you haven't really read the manga too much, which goes a fair bit more into the lore of Mewtwo than the anime or movies do. Essentially, Blaine and Mr. Fuji, who are brothers apparently, I learned that just in doing some of the research for this video, worked for Team Rocket on the Mewtwo project. They helped make Mewtwo, and Blaine's DNA is in Mewtwo, which, prior to the early 2000s, there was no way to do with any kind of repeatable success. So there was no way, we just kind of chalked it up to science fiction in a video game, so we just didn't think about it much. But now that we have CRISPR, that's a very real thing that, I'm not going to get into the ethics behind it all, but if you wanted to, you could take human DNA and put it in another organism. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So that could explain some of the physical differences between Mew and Mewtwo, but there's also just another kind of interesting thing in the real world that I want to talk about that might be more applicable. So you might have seen some articles about it every now and then on your social media. Whenever they update the project, it tends to get some buzz just because it's really interesting to think about. But it's something called the Dino Chicken Project, where essentially, using genetic technologies like CRISPR, they're trying to take chicken embryos and alter their DNA to make them what most people would recognize as a dinosaur. Because structurally, birds and dinosaurs are really not that different. Basically, all you have to do is get rid of the beak and give them teeth instead, change the wings back into separate digits with claws, and give them a longer tail with bones in it, and that's really the only difference. There's a team actually using genetic technologies like CRISPR to do this, and they're having pretty significant degrees of success. I'll link some news articles about it down in the description below, just for you guys to read, because they're really quite interesting. A lot of people in the paleontology community have a lot of reservations about this kind of thing. As you might be able to understand, just creating an entirely new organism for scientific purposes, really just because we can, gets into some of the things that Jeff Goldblum talked about in Jurassic Park. Like, just because you were so worried about whether you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. So a lot of us paleontologists have some really deep reservations about it, but that's a completely different topic for a different video. So just to sort of wrap it all together, Mewtwo was created from Mew's DNA through much, much trial and error, which created all the Ditto in the world. And I personally subscribe to that theory where Ditto was just failed Mew clones, because, while yes, CRISPR is extremely powerful, it is by no means, especially in its early stages, it is by no means 100% effective. I am positive that if Team Rocket scientists, as good as they might have been, were working on this scale of a change in an organism, that they would have had lots and lots of failures. The same thing with the Dino Chicken Project. They've been working on this for several years now and have not produced a viable organism yet. They either keep dying, or they just know that they will not survive, so they don't let it get that far in its development. So using CRISPR, they put in some human DNA to make Mew sort of bigger bodied, more bipedal, as well as they must have switched off some kind of gene analogous to the Myostatin gene in the CRISPR dogs that we talked about, but instead of making it more muscular, which I guess they could have done with a muscular gene as well, but I think they mostly did it with its psychically muscular genes. And that's why Mewtwo is so much more psychically powerful than Mew is. And the whole reason for this video is mostly just to talk about some of the really, truly incredible advances that we've made in science in the last handful of decades. Because, you know, like I've said a couple times in this video, back in 1996 when they sort of created the lore of Mew and Mewtwo, this was not possible. This was not even really thought about until I think around 2000, 2001 is when CRISPR began to be like the thing, and people realizing how powerful this kind of technology was. So if people didn't scientists who study these kinds of things didn't realize that this was a thing that they could use, there's no way a game company, a small at the time game company in Japan, would have really known about it. So like I said, I'm going to drop some articles and stuff for you guys to check out, just for some of the things that I was talking about down in the description below. Feel free to give those a read and let me know your thoughts on them. Whether you think that, you know, they had some other kind of technology that we don't have, whether you think that they used CRISPR, because CRISPR really is something out of science fiction, and I think it fits pretty well with the whole lore of Mew and Mewtwo personally. So that is going to wrap up this video. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. Now that I have an actual sort of schedule going on at school, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on Twitter because I actually have access to my college's entire collection of fossils, and you already know I've taken some photos using Pokemon Go, like the AR Plus, with some of the fossil Pokemon in the collections area surrounded by other real fossils. You know I've already done that. So keep an eye out for those on Twitter. They'll be coming soon. I'll try for once a week. That's probably the best I can commit to at this moment. Other than that, just feel free to like and or subscribe if you like all things Pokemon science. And as always, there's a time and place for everything.